You were never supposed to hear this story. In the mist-cloaked hollers of southeastern Kentucky, where time folds in on itself and the fog clings to your soul like memory, there lies a forgotten graveyard, a place locals whisper about only when the wind howls right. They call it the Garden of Purified Angels, but no map will guide you there. It exists between silence and shadow, and its caretakers. Three sisters, midwives by trade, saints by reputation. But what the townsfolk never knew, what they could never know, is that these women didn't just deliver life. They claimed it quietly, righteously, repeatedly. Between 1834 and 1859, more than 150 newborns were buried under the moonlit pines behind a modest cabin overlooking the Cumberland River. Each child marked, each death justified, each soul, according to their handwritten journals, purified. Because in the minds of Margaret, Catherine, and Agnes Morrison, God had given them a darker calling. They weren't midwives, they were divine exterminators, soldiers of heaven in calico dresses. This story isn't folklore. The journals were found, the graves exhumed. And yet you won't find this in any textbook. No documentary will dare explore it fully. Because to know what happened here is to confront the kind of faith that doesn't heal, but hunts. What you're about to hear isn't just a tale of forgotten cruelty. It's a descent into the psychology of righteousness weaponized when belief becomes blade. This is the truth behind the Morrison sisters, a truth buried beneath scripture and soil. And if you keep watching, you won't leave the same man. So ask yourself this: are you ready to dig, to exhume the secrets your ancestors buried with good reason? Because once you know, you cannot unknow. This isn't a ghost story. It's worse. It's history, and it's real. The year was 1834. The Appalachian Mountains stood as jagged sentinels, unchanging, unmoved. While inside the Morrison sisters' cabin, something was unraveling that would never be spoken of in church, nor confessed on any deathbed. But it all began innocently, as these stories often do. Three sisters, Margaret, Catherine, and Agnes, mountain midwives, Baptists, beloved by their community, trusted by every trembling mother within 3 counties. No one questioned them, because why would you question God's handmaidens? But here's what no one tells you. Isolation breeds invention, and in the hollows of Kentucky, where storms rolled in like judgment and religion was both law and comfort, the Morrison sisters built something no one saw coming: a doctrine of death. They studied scripture, yes, but they twisted it, folded verse over verse until their meaning sharpened into knives. They began to see signs everywhere, in the swirl of a child's birthmark, in the stillness between labored breaths, in the way a baby's hand curled just so. They weren't looking for medical anomalies. They were looking for corruption, for infestation, for the mark of the devil, and they found it again and again. Their journals, discovered 160 years later, sealed behind the prayer room's wall, are chilling, cold, calculated. One entry reads, February 12th. The mark was unmistakable, a smear of blood in the shape of the beast. We anointed him with silence. The Lord's work is never easy. Do you feel that? That sick churn in your stomach? That's not fear, it's recognition. Because something in you knows, beneath all the polite modernity, beneath the podcasts and politics and prayers, men like us have always feared the same thing: that those we trust most may be the ones closest to the abyss, that behind the preacher's smile or the midwife's hands could lie something ancient, something twisted, something righteous enough to kill. The Morrison sisters didn't hide behind darkness. They believed they were the light. That's what makes this story dangerous. They weren't mad. They were certain. Now keep going, because what they did next wasn't just evil, it was organized. By the spring of 1835, the Morrison sisters were no longer just midwives. They had become something far more dangerous, priests of purity, cloaked in aprons and scripture. Their transformation was silent, seamless. To the community, nothing had changed. The sisters still arrived in the dead of night, still whispered prayers over mothers in labor, still accepted jars of honey, eggs, and hand-woven cloth in place of coin. But beneath their modest smiles, their eyes had hardened. Their mission had sharpened. They now believed they were at war. And the enemy? Innocent infants, marked by signs only they could interpret. It wasn't chaos. It was a system. Catherine mapped the graves with the precision of a cartographer. Agnes collected herbs that could slow breathing or silence a cry. And Margaret, cold, brilliant Margaret, began writing a ledger of signs. It included dozens of birthmarks and features deemed unclean: skin too pale, hair too dark, extra digits, crossed eyes. Even premature birth became suspect. "The Lord does not make mistakes," and she wrote, "but the devil does, and he leaves his fingerprints on flesh." They called their killings purifications. That word again and again, like a mantra carved in ash. And no one asked, no one noticed, because sometimes the most terrifying evil is the kind that wears righteousness like a crown. Pause here. Take a breath. If you're still watching, comment the phrase, "I walk through the garden twice," not just once. Type it twice to mark that you've entered this story fully and cannot walk out unchanged, because the garden of purified angels still waits. The sisters didn't see themselves as killers. No, that's too small a word, too earthly. They saw themselves as divine instruments, sharpened by prayer, guided by holy fire, and in their minds, every child they purified was a soul rescued from corruption. Margaret wrote, "We do not murder, we intercede." That was their gospel, and they believed it with terrifying sincerity. But belief, gufran, belief without challenge becomes dogma, and dogma with blood on its hands becomes a machine. By the winter of 1836, the Morrison sisters were no longer waiting for signs. They were searching for them, scanning every newborn with narrowed eyes, judging each body as a battlefield between heaven and hell. If they found even the smallest blemish, a twisted toe, a pale lip, a crooked cry, it was enough. They would dismiss the family under the guise of medical concern, and within minutes the child would be gone, silenced, buried, prayed over. One mother, Anna Rigsby, later recalled waking in the night after childbirth and asking for her baby. Agnes stood at her bedside, hands folded, eyes wet. "He was too fragile," she said. "The Lord called him home early." What Anna never knew, what she was never allowed to know, was that her son had been breathing just fine, until Margaret covered his mouth and whispered a psalm. And what's worse, the community praised them. Infant mortality was high in the mountains. Every loss was met with resignation. God's will, they said. At least he died in good hands. They brought gifts. They wept with the sisters. Some even called the Morrison cabin a place of holy mercy. Do you understand how dark that is? The killers weren't hiding in shadows. They were surrounded by candlelight, trusted, loved, shielded by the very faith they were perverting. That's the truth most men can't handle. Not that evil exists, but that it often walks hand in hand with the sacred, that the holiest smiles can hide the deadliest beliefs, and that when you trust blindly, you don't just risk your life, you risk your lineage. The prayer room was always locked. Visitors to the Morrison cabin, the grieving, the expectant, the faithful, were kept far from its door. It sat at the top of a narrow staircase, framed by dry herbs and scripture verses pinned to the walls like talismans. The sisters said it was sacred, a place for communion, for revelation. But behind that warped wooden door was not prayer. It was doctrine, a doctrine built not from heaven, but from fear. Inside the prayer room, the walls were lined with pages, Bible verses, medical drawings, handwritten warnings. In the center stood a table, scorched with wax and stained with ink. Here, Margaret wrote. Here, Catherine transcribed birth anomalies into lists. And here, Agnes knelt, whispering fevered chants from a torn copy of the Book of Revelations, convinced that every child born imperfect was a vessel for something ancient, something crawling beneath the skin of the world, waiting to break through. They called it the doctrine of taint. It stated that the fall of man, Eve's betrayal, left a residue, a spiritual defect passed through generations, and most dangerously, it sometimes manifested physically. Their job, to find it, to end it, to purify the bloodline. We are not women, Margaret once wrote. We are the flood that Noah begged for. And here's the most disturbing part. They weren't alone. Letters discovered among the journals hint at correspondence with a preacher in Georgia, one Reverend Elias Granger. His replies are cryptic, yet encouraging. The blemish is the gate, he writes. Close it before it swings wide. God needs wolves now, not lambs. This wasn't a lone madness. It was a network of rot, a shared belief passed secretly among midwives, pastors, healers, whispering that some children should not live. That's why this story matters. Because it didn't die in Kentucky, it traveled. Like a virus wearing the robes of the righteous, ask yourself, how many faith healers, how many herbalists, how many divinely guided caregivers across the 19th century practiced the same grim ritual, all while claiming the light? The prayer room was their sanctuary, but it was also their factory, where ideology became execution. In Section 6, I'll take you inside one of their purification rituals, step by agonizing step. You say you want the truth? Let's see if you can survive it. It began with Scripture, always Scripture. Before any cries were silenced, before a mother's sobs could stain the wood floor with grief, the ritual began with Margaret opening her worn, sweat-stained Bible to the same passage, Leviticus 21:17. Whosoever hath a blemish shall not approach. Her voice would be steady, cold, not cruel, not angry, certain. Certainty is what made her dangerous. Once the passage was read, she would place the Bible beside the infant. Agnes, ever delicate, would retrieve the iron basin of water they'd claim was for cleansing. Catherine would close the shutters. They said it was for the mother's rest. It was for secrecy, darkness, control. The child, usually only minutes or hours old, would be inspected. They called it the viewing. Hands trembled only slightly as they examined the skin for signs, patches, tones, discolorations, twitches, marks of possession, they believed, evidence that the child had already been claimed by something unholy. They never saw these babies as innocent, only as seeds of corruption. Once identified, Margaret would place a tiny cross, carved by Agnes, on the infant's chest. Catherine would hold the child gently, whispering, "You will not suffer. You will not bring darkness." And then it happened. No ceremony, no violence, just two hands, placed calmly over the mouth and nose. 3 breaths. That's all it took. The movement stopped. The cross fell. Agnes would whisper, "Purified." Then came the silence. Not guilt, not grief, but a kind of spiritual high. The journals speak of it with reverence. "The silence after is the holiest part," one entry reads. "Heaven opens in the hush." And you know what makes this more horrifying? They believed they were doing the child a favor, that in stealing its breath, they were saving its soul. That hell had no grip on what was never allowed to sin. Their logic wasn't madness. It was twisted faith, structured, consistent, armored in Scripture. They didn't kill babies. They cleansed them. That is what they told themselves, what they told God, what they wrote. But evil does not need horns or knives. Sometimes it comes with lavender hands and lullabies. We're going deeper still. In Section 7, we uncover the night that almost exposed everything, the mother who didn't fall asleep, and the child they couldn't silence. It was the night of September 3rd, 1837. Thunder rolled low across the Cumberland Hills, shaking the Morrison cabin like a warning. Inside, lantern light cast long shadows across the birthing floor as Esther Delaney, 22, strong-willed and sharp-eyed, labored through her first child. Her husband, Joseph, waited outside with 2 of the sisters' horses tied nearby, unaware that this birth would be unlike any the Morrison sisters had ever attended. The child came fast, a girl, breathing, crying, healthy, but in her lower back, just above the spine, a long, curved patch of pale flesh marbled with red veins. It looked like a sickle. Catherine stiffened. Margaret whispered, "He leaves his mark close to the root." Esther, though exhausted, refused to sleep. Her eyes followed every movement. When Agnes tried to take the child away for inspection, Esther sat upright and reached. "She stays with me," she said, her voice cracked but firm. Agnes smiled, soft as ever. "Of course, dear, but let us cleanse her first. It's tradition." But Esther didn't come from blind tradition. She'd been raised Methodist, educated, literate. She'd studied anatomy in a missionary school. She knew what birthmarks were, knew what the blood vessels under infant skin looked like, and something in her sensed it. That quiet urgency, the 2 practiced movements, the way Margaret's hand hovered a second too long over the baby's chest. So she made a decision that saved a life. She reached under her blanket and pulled out a knife, small, rusted, a paring knife used to cut wild apples. But she held it like a woman who had been taught to survive. "Touch my baby again," she said, "and the Lord won't be the only one you answer to." The sisters froze. This had never happened before. No mother had resisted. No woman had challenged the ritual. For a moment, the Morrison legend cracked. Esther's daughter survived. They named her Miriam. But here's what's chilling. Weeks later, Esther's cabin burned to the ground. No cause determined. No charges filed. Esther and her family vanished into Tennessee, never heard from again. In Margaret's journal, one line appeared under the date of the fire. The unpurified walk among us, but the fire restores what water could not. In Section 8, we explore how the Morrison sisters dealt with dissent and what happened to the two ministers who asked too many questions. Dissent was a fire the Morrison sisters learned to smother early, and like any empire built on fear, their first instinct was always control, influence, silence, but not through violence. Not at first. The sisters were far too clever for that. They didn't threaten. They guided. They used guilt like a scalpel and scripture like steel. But by 1838, rumors had begun to stir. Whispers that not all the Morrison children died from natural causes, that the sisters kept no baptism records for the lost, that one of them, Agnes, was seen burying something in the snow before sunrise. Most dismiss these as mountain gossip, but two men did not. Reverend Paul Travis, a soft-spoken Methodist minister from Pine Hollow, and Reverend Elijah Moore, a firebrand preacher with a harsh tongue and sharp eyes from Leather Ridge. Both had growing congregations. Both had lost parishioners' infants under the Morrison sisters' care, and both started asking questions. Elijah Moore was the first to confront them. He arrived at the cabin one rainy evening in June. He didn't knock. He stormed in. His voice thundered through the birthing room. "You speak of purity, but I smell rot in your walls. If you claim to serve God, then open your graves and show me the proof." Margaret did not flinch. She served him tea, calmly, precisely. She quoted Isaiah. She wept as she told him how hard it was to lose so many babies, how she and her sisters grieved more than anyone could imagine. Catherine offered him one of the infants' hand-knitted bonnets as a keepsake. By the time he left, Elijah Moore had no proof, only suspicion. A week later, his horse was found wandering near a cliff. His body was never recovered. Locals said he drank too much that night. Fell. A shame. Reverend Paul Travis was quieter, smarter. He didn't confront the sisters. He watched, listened. He began copying their movements, collecting testimonies from grieving parents. He sent letters to Lexington, requesting an inquest. One morning in September, his chapel caught fire. He escaped, but he never preached again. Instead, he vanished into obscurity. Moved west, became a school teacher in Ohio. In his personal journal, found by his grandson in 1901, he wrote, "There are women in Kentucky who kill in the name of God, and God in his silence lets them." In Section 9, we reveal what those letters from Lexington uncovered, and how the authorities came this close to uncovering the Garden of Purified Angels. The year was 1839, and for the first time the Morrison sisters were under the eye of men with pens, not pitchforks. Two of Reverend Paul Travis's letters had reached Lexington, quietly passed between clerks, buried beneath county documents and ecclesiastical records. But they were read. One by a Dr. Emmett Hollingsworth, a physician turned investigator for the newly formed Kentucky Board of Public Health. A rare man for his time, educated, skeptical, and deeply disturbed by unlicensed midwifery practices in rural regions. His curiosity was piqued not by the spiritual language of the letter, but by the numbers. According to local baptism logs, the Morrison sisters had attended over 800 births in 5 counties, but less than half had corresponding living children by the time of the first census in 1840. Too many infants, too few names, too many deaths conveniently blamed on fever, defects, or God's will. So Dr. Hollingsworth made a decision that nearly changed history. He rode to Harlan County, alone. He arrived on horseback in October, posing as a medical lecturer visiting frontier caregivers. He interviewed 3 mothers whose children had died under the sisters' watch. 2 of them repeated the exact same phrases. The Lord took him early. They said it was best. And that was by design. The Morrison sisters had built their true altar deeper in the woods, 1 mile down an old Cherokee trail, past a creek that no outsider knew by name. A place they called only the Hollow, a place where the wind carried no echo. Dr. Hollingsworth left with suspicions, but no proof. His report was filed, labeled inconclusive, further study required, then forgotten. And so once again, the Garden of Purified Angels survived. But in Section 10, something even more chilling surfaces. A 4th journal hidden inside the floorboards of a cabin long since rotted, written not by Margaret, not by Catherine, but by Agnes. And its contents change everything. Agnes Morrison was the youngest, the gentlest, the one people trusted most. But beneath her angelic face and tender hands lay the darkest soul of them all. When her journal was discovered in 1923, hidden beneath the warped floorboards of what remained of the Morrison cabin, it wasn't found by a historian, not a preacher, not a detective. It was found by a boy named Elias Grant, 13 years old, scavenging for dry firewood with his uncle. The cabin had been reduced to nothing more than a collapsed skeleton wrapped in ivy and moss. But under a rotted floor beam, Elias found it, a leather-bound book wrapped in oilcloth, completely dry, completely intact. And what was inside was not scripture. It was obsession. Agnes's handwriting was meticulous, delicate script, looping and perfect. But the words? Unholy. She didn't call them purifications. She called them love offerings. She believed the infants weren't just being saved, they were being gifted. Given as blood sacrifices to what she described not as God, but the bright one who watches from the trees. She spoke of dreams, recurring visions of a tall, black-eyed figure standing in the woods near the hollow. She called it the tall shepherd. She wrote that it whispered to her in languages she didn't know, but somehow understood. It told her which children carried the stain. It told her when to strike. And it wasn't just the children. Agnes claimed that the herbs they planted over the graves were not for beauty or even medicine. They were offerings, seeds given to bind the spirits of the purified to the land, so they could serve the bright one in the kingdom beneath the earth. She didn't see herself as a servant of God anymore. She believed she had become something more. One passage reads, "Each little breath I take is stolen from the corrupted and fed to him. He grows stronger. The land remembers. When the time comes and he rises, he will not forget my work. I will be his bride in the world made clean." Margaret's journal was filled with righteousness, Catherine's with procedure, but Agnes's was worship.